Some dogs don't stop eating because they are sick. They stop because they are waiting for someone who never came back. At 5:42 a.m. on a quiet military K-9 training facility outside San Diego, California, the world felt unusually still, the kind of stillness that presses against the skin like cold glass. Inside Kennel Block 3, a white German shepherd named Ghost lay motionless on a reinforced cot, his body curled in a tight, defensive shape as if protecting something invisible only he could see. A stainless steel bowl sat untouched less than 3 feet away, the morning ration still perfectly arranged, dry kibble reflecting the dim fluorescent light above. It had been 72 hours since Ghost last ate, 72 hours since he last responded to a command, and 72 hours since anyone had heard anything from him beyond the faint rhythm of his breathing. The handlers had tried everything within protocol, new food formulas, extended exercise, even calm verbal reinforcement sessions designed to rebuild trust after operational trauma. But Ghost did not respond to any of it. He did not growl, did not whimper, did not resist. He simply withdrew, as if the world beyond the kennel glass had become a place he no longer recognized. Staff Sergeant Daniel Harlow stood outside the reinforced observation window, arms crossed, watching the dog with a tired patience that came from too many long nights and too few answers. At 38, Harlow had seen dozens of K-9 cases come through the program. But this was different. Ghost wasn't distressed in the usual way, he was absent, like a light had been switched off behind his eyes. Still no intake? He asked quietly without looking away. A young veterinary technician beside him shook her head. No, sir. Not food, not water beyond minimal, not even eye contact for long. It's like he's waiting for something we can't provide. Harlow exhaled slowly, his gaze narrowing as Ghost shifted slightly inside the kennel, repositioning just enough to face the door again. Always the door. There was something unsettling about that pattern, not aggression, not fear, but expectation. Somewhere deeper in the base, a door opened and closed. Boots echoed faintly across the concrete corridor, and Ghost's ears twitched once, barely noticeable, but precise, like a sensor detecting a frequency buried beneath noise. No one spoke for a moment. The fluorescent hum filled the silence instead, steady and indifferent. Ghost had once been paired with Sergeant Ethan Cole, a Marine known for his quiet discipline and unshakable composure under pressure. They had operated together for 3 years in overseas deployments, forming the kind of bond that required no words, only rhythm and trust built under conditions most people would never see. But that partnership had ended abruptly after a mission review, classified circumstances, and a recovery assignment that pulled Ethan away from active field rotation. Since then, Ghost had been reassigned, retrained, and monitored, yet something in him had never fully reset. Harlow stepped closer to the glass, lowering his voice. He hasn't been like this before, the technician asked. Harlow hesitated. Not like this. After Ethan was pulled out, he adjusted. Slowly, but he adjusted. This is different. Inside the kennel, Ghost lifted his head slightly for the first time in hours. His pale coat caught the light in soft gradients of white and silver, his amber eyes scanning the corridor beyond the reinforced door with a focus that suddenly felt intentional, as if he had heard something others had not. A distant sound echoed again, subtle, almost lost within the structure of the building, a rhythm of footsteps that did not belong to routine personnel movement. Ghost's breathing changed, not faster, not calmer, but sharper, as if memory itself had been activated. Harlow noticed immediately. Did someone just enter the north corridor? He asked. No one answered right away. The technician checked her tablet. No scheduled entries. Ghost stood slowly then, not aggressively, not urgently, but with a controlled tension that made the air feel different around him. He stepped forward until his nose nearly touched the kennel gate, frozen in place, eyes locked on a direction that no one else had been instructed to notice. And then, just as quietly as it began, everything in him seemed to hold its breath. The corridor outside Kennel Block 3 carried the quiet rhythm of regulated footsteps, steady and unhurried. Yet Ghost reacted as if time itself had bent around that sound. His body remained perfectly still, but his attention was no longer in the kennel. It was beyond it, locked onto something invisible that only memory could translate into certainty. Staff Sergeant Daniel Harlow noticed the shift immediately, his eyes narrowing as he stepped closer to the reinforced glass. "That is not routine behavior," he murmured, almost to himself. The veterinary technician beside him leaned in, watching the same direction Ghost was now fixating on. "It looks like he recognizes something," she said softly, uncertainty in her voice. Ghost did not move his paws, did not vocalize, did not break protocol in any obvious way, but everything about him had changed, as if an internal system had suddenly come online after a long silence. Then, from the far end of the corridor, a figure appeared. At first, it was just a silhouette framed by the harsh white lighting of the hallway, tall, steady, carrying the controlled posture of someone trained by discipline and repetition. As he moved closer, details began to resolve. A worn military jacket, sleeves slightly rolled, boots quiet against the polished floor, and a presence that did not rush or hesitate. Sergeant Ethan Cole had returned to the base after a period of recovery and reassignment, though nothing about his expression suggested ease. Instead, there was a quiet weight behind his eyes, the kind that comes from carrying memories that never fully settle. He paused near the observation glass, not immediately entering the kennel area, as if instinct alone had guided him to stop at a distance first. Inside the kennel, Ghost's breathing changed again, shallower now, sharper, as though every inhale was tied to recognition he was still trying to confirm. Ethan did not speak at first. He simply looked through the reinforced barrier, his gaze settling on the white German shepherd, as if searching for something beneath the surface of what he was seeing. Ghost took a single step forward, then stopped, his body lowering slightly into a posture that was neither defensive nor submissive, but deeply conflicted, as though two instincts were pulling in opposite directions at once. The silence between them was not empty. It was loaded, layered with time that neither could measure in words. Harlow watched carefully, his arms now uncrossed, his professional detachment giving way to quiet observation. "That is Sergeant Cole," he said under his breath, confirming what everyone in the corridor already suspected but had not yet said aloud. The veterinary technician nodded, eyes fixed on the kennel. "They were paired before reassignment," she replied. Ghost's ears twitched again, and for the first time since this encounter began, a faint sound escaped him, not a bark or a whine, but something softer, almost broken in its restraint, as if emotion had pushed against a boundary it could no longer fully contain. Ethan finally moved closer to the glass. His hand rose slightly, then stopped short of touching it, hovering instead, as if he was unsure whether permission still existed between them. "Hey, Ghost," he said quietly, voice low and steady, carrying no command, only acknowledgement. At the sound of his name, something in Ghost fractured in the smallest possible way. His front paws shifted forward, claws lightly tapping against the kennel floor, and his head tilted, as though trying to reconcile what his senses were confirming with what absence had taught him to deny. The room around them seemed to narrow, the corridor noise fading, the fluorescent hum receding into something distant and irrelevant. Harlow took a slow step back, sensing that what was unfolding did not belong to procedure or observation anymore. Ethan exhaled, his gaze never leaving the dog. "I thought they would have retrained you by now," he said softly, almost like a confession rather than a statement. Ghost responded by lowering his head slightly, pressing closer to the glass, as if trying to shorten a distance that could not be physically crossed but had already been crossed somewhere else entirely. The technician looked at Harlow. "He has not touched food since the reassignment order came through," she whispered. Harlow did not answer immediately. His attention was still on the two figures separated by reinforced glass and years of silence. Ghost's body trembled once, subtle but unmistakable, and then he did something no one in the facility had seen in days. He sat down, not in defeat, but in recognition, as if the waiting had finally found its reason again. Ghost remained seated, but it was not the stillness of obedience. It was the stillness of recognition, the kind that happens when something long buried finally surfaces and refuses to stay hidden. His amber eyes stayed locked on Ethan Cole through the reinforced glass, unblinking, as if afraid that even a fraction of a second of distraction might erase the moment entirely. Ethan stood just beyond the barrier, his posture steady but no longer rigid, his gaze softened in a way few people had ever seen from him. There was something in his expression that carried both restraint and memory at the same time, as if he were holding back an entire conversation that had no words. Staff Sergeant Daniel Harlow slowly stepped closer again, his voice careful and low. "He is responding to you more than any stimulus we have tried in days," he said. The veterinary technician nodded beside him, scanning the behavioral chart on her tablet. His intake refusal aligns with emotional withdrawal patterns. He is not rejecting food. He is rejecting absence. The words lingered in the air, heavier than their clinical tone suggested. Ethan's eyes flicked briefly toward them, then back to Ghost. "He was never trained to function on absence," Ethan said quietly, almost as if speaking to himself. Ghost shifted forward by a few inches, pressing closer to the glass again, his breath fogging the reinforced surface in small rhythmic bursts. Each exhale seemed measured, controlled, as if he was trying to regulate something inside him that had become unstable. The kennel light reflected faintly off his white coat, giving him an almost spectral appearance, a living memory trapped between silence and signal. Harlow studied the interaction carefully. "What changed during reassignment?" he asked, though the question felt more like reflection than procedure. No one answered immediately. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, not in tension but in recollection. "We were separated after an operation review," he said after a moment. "He was pulled into retraining. I was pulled into recovery status. There was no transition for him, just absence." Ghost's ears flicked at Ethan's voice again, reacting not to command but to tone, to cadence, to something deeper than sound. The veterinary technician took a slow breath. "That level of imprinting can explain his current state," she said. "He is not malfunctioning. He is searching." Ethan nodded once, acknowledging the interpretation without agreeing or denying it. Ghost rose again slowly, this time stepping closer to the front of the kennel until his nose nearly touched the reinforced surface. The distance between them was less than an arm's length, yet it felt like an entire deployment away. Ethan finally lowered his hand fully this time, placing it against the glass. Ghost mirrored the motion instantly, pressing his paw to the exact same point on the other side. The contact was not physical, but the alignment of it carried weight, as if both had synchronized to a memory neither had fully let go of. Harlow exhaled quietly, breaking his own stillness. "We should not be observing this without protocol review," he said, though he made no move to intervene. No one did. Ghost let out a soft breath, almost a sigh, and his posture shifted again, not collapsing, not withdrawing, but settling, as if the tension that had kept him suspended for days was finally loosening by degrees. Ethan's voice dropped lower. "You waited," he said simply. Ghost tilted his head slightly at the sound, eyes narrowing just a fraction, as if confirming meaning beyond language. In that moment, the kennel corridor seemed to shrink further, the sterile environment fading into something quieter, something older, where connection did not require permission from systems or schedules. The veterinary technician glanced at Harlow again. "If we continue exposure, we may see reintegration response," she said. Harlow did not respond immediately. He was still watching the stillness between man and dog, a stillness that did not feel empty anymore. It felt occupied. Ghost remained at the glass, unwavering, as if he had decided that whatever came next would not require him to wait in silence anymore. The corridor outside Kennel Block 3 felt quieter now, not because the facility had changed, but because something inside it had. Ghost no longer sat frozen in uncertainty. Instead, he remained close to the reinforced glass, his presence steady, as if he had accepted that the other side of that barrier was no longer absence, but possibility. Staff Sergeant Daniel Harlow observed this shift with cautious attention, his arms now resting loosely at his sides rather than crossed, as though even his posture had adjusted to the change in atmosphere. The veterinary technician reviewed the live behavioral feed again, her voice calm but precise. "His stress indicators are lowering," she said. "Heart rate is stabilizing. Respiration is no longer irregular." Ethan Cole stood on the opposite side of the glass, still, measured, his eyes never leaving Ghost. There was no urgency in him, only recognition, as if he understood that whatever had been broken between them could not be repaired through force or command, only through patience that matched the weight of time that had passed. Ghost suddenly shifted his weight, stepping back a fraction, then forward again, repeating the motion once, as if testing the boundary between memory and reality. His ears remained forward, alert, but not tense. Harlow noticed and spoke quietly. We can initiate a controlled proximity session if both handler and animal show stability. The technician hesitated briefly before nodding. Approval aligns with recovery protocol under supervised reintegration conditions. Ethan turned slightly at the words, not surprised, but thoughtful. You are suggesting access, he said. Harlow responded carefully. We are suggesting confirmation of response under non-barrier conditions. Nothing more at this stage. Ethan looked back at Ghost, and for the first time since arriving, he exhaled in a way that felt less like restraint and more like release. Then open it, he said quietly. The statement was not a command in tone, but it carried certainty. The technician glanced at Harlow, who nodded after a brief pause. A security officer down the corridor activated the manual release sequence for the intermediate containment gate, the heavy locking mechanism disengaging with a controlled mechanical sound that echoed softly through the hall. Ghost reacted instantly, not with fear, but with focus. His body aligned toward the opening section of the kennel corridor, ears forward, eyes locked. The secondary gate slid open slowly, creating a narrow, controlled passage between containment and observation space. Ethan stepped forward into the designated zone, stopping at the marked boundary line indicated by yellow floor markings. He did not enter the kennel itself, nor did Ghost leave his space. They remained separated, but now only by controlled distance rather than reinforced isolation. The silence that followed was different from before. It was no longer suspended in uncertainty, but in expectation. Ghost took a single step forward into the corridor space, then stopped again, watching Ethan closely, as if confirming that what he saw matched what he remembered. Ethan lowered himself slowly into a kneeling position, maintaining steady posture, hands visible and open, not reaching, not calling. You do not have to guess anymore, Ethan said softly. Ghost's head tilted slightly at the sound of his voice, as though the words themselves carried weight beyond language. Harlow observed from behind the glass partition, his expression neutral but attentive. He is choosing engagement, he noted quietly. The technician responded. This level of voluntary approach suggests full recognition recall. Ghost advanced another step, then another, each movement deliberate, controlled, until he reached the marked boundary where the corridor space ended. He stopped there, breathing steadily, eyes locked on Ethan's face. Ethan did not move forward to close the gap. Instead, he remained still, allowing Ghost to make the decision entirely on his own. A long moment passed in complete silence, the kind that carries more meaning than sound ever could. Then Ghost lowered his head slightly, not in submission, but in acknowledgement, as if something within him had finally aligned after being scattered for too long. Ethan's voice softened further. I did not forget you, he said. At those words, something in Ghost shifted visibly. His posture loosened, tension dissolving from his frame in a way that was almost imperceptible at first, then undeniable. He took the final step forward, closing the remaining distance until he stood directly in front of Ethan, separated only by the rules of protocol that no longer felt as significant as they once had. Ethan slowly extended his hand, stopping just short of contact again, waiting. Ghost leaned forward, pressing his head gently into the space where Ethan's hand hovered, bridging the gap himself. Harlow looked away briefly, not because of procedure, but because the moment felt too complete to observe without interruption. The technician lowered her gaze to the monitor, quietly recording the stabilization data. Ethan remained still, his hand finally resting lightly against Ghost's head, the first physical connection since their separation. Ghost closed his eyes for a brief moment, his entire body settling as if something within him had finally found its place again. The corridor lights continued their steady hum, unchanged, but everything within that space had shifted into something that no longer belonged to absence. Ghost remained still beneath Ethan Cole's hand, but the stillness was no longer emptiness. It was acceptance, the kind that comes when distance finally collapses into something familiar again. His breathing had slowed into a steady rhythm, no longer fragmented or uncertain, and his amber eyes, though still alert, carried a softness that had not been present moments before. Ethan did not move his hand away. He simply kept it there, resting lightly against the top of Ghost's head, as if afraid that even the smallest withdrawal might undo what had just been restored. Staff Sergeant Daniel Harlow observed quietly from behind the glass partition, his expression measured but no longer purely professional. The veterinary technician beside him reviewed the live readings again, then spoke in a lowered voice. His cortisol levels have dropped significantly. This is a full stabilization response. Harlow nodded once, but his attention remained on the interaction unfolding in the corridor. This is not just stabilization, he said quietly. This is recognition with emotional anchoring. Ghost shifted slightly closer to Ethan, pressing his body forward just enough that the remaining distance between them felt almost non-existent. Ethan finally exhaled more deeply, his posture easing further as he allowed his other hand to rise slowly, resting it along Ghost's shoulder. The movement was deliberate, controlled, giving the animal full space to withdraw if he chose to, but Ghost did not withdraw. Instead, he leaned into it. The corridor lighting remained unchanged, cold and fluorescent, but the atmosphere no longer felt sterile. It felt suspended, as if time had temporarily adjusted its pace to accommodate something more fragile than procedure. Ethan spoke again, voice low and steady. "You stayed longer than I expected." Ghost's ears flicked at the tone, and he responded with a small shift of weight, pressing closer, as though the meaning of the words mattered more than their structure. Harlow stepped slightly closer to the glass, his voice careful. "We should begin documenting reintegration parameters. Prolonged contact may trigger full behavioral normalization." The technician nodded but did not look away from the scene. "It is already happening," she said softly. Ethan did not respond to their discussion. His focus remained entirely on Ghost, as if everything outside that moment had receded into background noise. Ghost suddenly lifted his head slightly, turning it toward Ethan's face, studying him with a level of attention that felt both searching and certain at the same time. Ethan met that gaze without hesitation. "I am here," he said simply. There was no command structure in the statement, no military tone, only presence. Ghost responded by pressing his forehead gently against Ethan's chest, closing the final emotional distance that protocol could not define. Ethan's hand tightened slightly on Ghost's shoulder, not in restraint, but in grounding. The veterinary technician glanced at Harlow. "Again, this level of attachment recovery is rare after full separation cycles," she said. Harlow nodded slowly. "It means the bond was never fully broken," he replied. Inside the corridor, Ghost remained pressed against Ethan, his breathing now completely steady, his posture no longer uncertain. Ethan lowered his head slightly, resting his forehead briefly against Ghost's fur, a motion so subtle it almost disappeared into stillness. Neither moved for several seconds. The facility around them continued its normal operations, distant footsteps echoing, monitors beeping, doors opening and closing in regulated rhythm, but within the corridor space, nothing else seemed to matter. Ghost finally shifted just enough to look up again, his amber eyes reflecting the overhead light, calm now, grounded, present. Ethan met that gaze and gave a faint nod, as if confirming something that did not require language. Harlow turned slightly away from the glass, his voice quieter now. "We will need to update the case file," he said. The technician responded without looking up. "There is nothing left to correct. He has already come back." Ghost remained at Ethan's side, no longer searching, no longer waiting, simply present in a way that suggested the waiting had finally ended. Ghost stayed close to Ethan Cole as they moved together through the quiet interior corridor of the K-9 facility, his steps no longer hesitant but measured, as if he had finally accepted that the space around him was no longer uncertain. The reinforced glass doors behind them slid shut with a soft mechanical sound, but neither Ghost nor Ethan reacted to it, as if the world beyond their immediate connection had become secondary. Staff Sergeant Daniel Harlow walked a few paces behind, maintaining professional distance while still observing every subtle shift in behavior. The veterinary technician accompanied him, tablet in hand, quietly documenting real-time stabilization metrics, though her attention kept drifting back to the bond forming in front of her eyes. Ethan's hand remained lightly resting on Ghost's shoulder, not guiding, not controlling, simply present, and Ghost responded to that presence by staying aligned at his side, matching each step without hesitation. The corridor opened into a controlled outdoor exercise yard, enclosed by high chain link fencing and softened by early morning light that filtered through a thin layer of coastal haze. The air outside carried a faint salt freshness mixed with the scent of damp grass, a sensory contrast to the sterile interior they had just left. Ghost paused briefly at the threshold, not from fear, but from recalibration, as if confirming that this new environment still belonged to the same reality as the man beside him. Ethan stopped with him, giving space without instruction. "Take your time," Ethan said calmly. The words were simple, but they landed with familiarity, and Ghost responded by stepping forward first, testing the ground, then continuing with more confidence. Harlow watched closely, his voice low as he spoke to the technician. Transition response is smoother than expected. He is not resisting external environment exposure. The technician nodded. He is not just adapting. He is following a reference anchor. Harlow glanced at her. "Ethan Cole." She confirmed with a quiet nod. Inside the yard, Ghost began to move in a slow circuit, not aimless, but exploratory, staying within a close radius of Ethan at all times. Ethan did not call him back or direct him, instead simply walking forward at a steady pace, allowing Ghost to choose proximity on his own terms. After several moments, Ghost completed a full loop of the yard and returned to Ethan's side, sitting down without prompting. The action carried a quiet certainty, as if he had completed a mental check and confirmed that nothing essential had changed during his brief separation. Ethan looked down at him and gave a faint nod of acknowledgement. "Still here," he said softly. Ghost's ears flicked at the tone, and his posture relaxed further, shoulders lowering slightly as tension continued to release from his frame. Harlow stepped closer to the fence line, speaking carefully. "We should introduce controlled reinforcement activities. Feeding response, basic retrieval cues, non-stress conditioning." The technician reviewed her data again. "He has not accepted food since prior to separation. We may need to re-establish feeding association through handler proximity." Ethan listened without interrupting, then looked down at Ghost again. "Let us try something simple," he said. A handler placed a small stainless steel bowl of food near the edge of the yard, maintaining distance. Ghost looked at it briefly, then looked back at Ethan, as if comparing 2 points of reference. Ethan slowly crouched down, keeping his movements calm and unhurried. "It is okay," he said quietly. Ghost hesitated for only a moment before moving forward, not toward the bowl first, but toward Ethan. He stopped within arm's reach, then shifted slightly until his shoulder lightly touched Ethan's knee. Only then did he turn his head toward the food again. The silence in the yard deepened, not from tension, but from anticipation. Ghost lowered his head and took a small step toward the bowl, then another. He paused again, glancing back once more at Ethan, as if confirming permission through presence rather than command. Ethan did not speak, only remained steady. Ghost finally lowered his head fully and began to eat, slowly at first, then with steady consistency. The veterinary technician exhaled quietly. "That is the first full intake since separation," she said. Harlow nodded, but his attention remained fixed on Ethan and Ghost. Ethan placed one hand gently on Ghost's back as he ate, not guiding, only grounding. Ghost did not flinch or pause, continuing calmly, as if the act itself had been waiting for this exact moment to feel natural again. When he finally finished, he lifted his head and sat back down beside Ethan, remaining close, his breathing even and calm. Ethan looked down at him and spoke softly, almost like a confirmation only they needed to understand. "You are not alone in this anymore." Ghost leaned slightly into his side in response, and for the first time since the separation, there was no searching in his eyes, only presence. The morning light over the K9 facility yard had shifted slightly, becoming warmer, softer, as if even the atmosphere itself had adjusted to the change unfolding within it. Ghost remained seated beside Ethan Cole, no longer tense, no longer searching, but fully present in a way that felt grounded and natural, as if he had finally returned to a rhythm he had been missing without understanding why. Ethan's hand rested lightly on his back, steady and unmoving, a simple contact that required no command structure, no reinforcement protocol, only continuity. Staff Sergeant Daniel Harlow stood near the perimeter fence, watching in silence that now felt more reflective than analytical. The veterinary technician beside him lowered her tablet slightly, no longer needing to constantly update metrics to understand what was happening in front of them. "This is beyond stabilization," she said quietly. Harlow nodded once, his eyes still fixed on the pair in the center of the yard. "This is restoration," he replied. Ghost suddenly shifted his head upward, scanning the perimeter of the yard as a distant sound echoed faintly from the base, the kind of ambient noise that would normally be ignored. But this time, Ghost reacted differently. His ears lifted slightly, not in alarm, but in recognition of something layered beneath routine sound. Ethan noticed immediately. "You hear something familiar?" he asked softly. Ghost did not respond verbally, of course, but he stood slowly, remaining close to Ethan as he adjusted his position. The movement was calm, deliberate, and controlled, as if he was confirming that even unfamiliar sounds could now exist without disrupting his sense of grounding. Harlow observed carefully. "Auditory association response is still active," he said. "He is not only responding to Ethan. He is recalibrating environmental familiarity through him." The technician nodded in agreement. "He is using Ethan as a reference anchor for all external input." Ethan looked down at Ghost and gave a faint, understanding nod. "You do not have to figure everything out at once," he said quietly. Ghost took a few steps forward across the yard, then paused, looking back at Ethan to ensure he was still there. Ethan followed at a steady pace, maintaining distance that was close enough to reassure but far enough to allow independence. The dynamic between them had shifted from reunion into something more subtle, something that resembled trust being rebuilt in real time rather than remembered. Ghost began to walk the perimeter of the yard again, this time slower, more intentional, occasionally glancing back at Ethan with a consistency that felt less like checking and more like acknowledgement. After several minutes, he stopped near the center of the yard and sat again, this time with no hesitation. Ethan approached and lowered himself beside him, sitting on the ground in a calm, unhurried motion. There was no urgency in either of them now, only shared presence. Harlow stepped closer to the fence line, his voice quiet but steady. "We should document this phase carefully," he said. "This level of behavioral reattachment could set a precedent for future K9 recovery protocols." The technician did not respond immediately, still watching Ghost and Ethan. After a moment, she spoke softly. "This is not protocol-driven recovery anymore. This is relational reintegration." Harlow did not argue. He simply watched. Ghost leaned slightly toward Ethan, resting his shoulder against him again, and Ethan responded by placing a steady hand on him once more. The contact was simple, but it carried continuity, as if each moment was reinforcing the last without needing instruction. Ethan spoke quietly, his voice carrying no authority, only certainty. "You are home in your own way now." Ghost closed his eyes briefly at the sound of his voice, then opened them again, calm and steady. The yard remained quiet, the air unchanged, the facility still operating in the distance with its normal rhythm of movement and procedure. But within the enclosed space of that moment, something had settled into place that no measurement system could fully quantify. Ghost stayed beside Ethan without shifting, no longer searching, no longer waiting, only existing in a state that finally felt complete. The afternoon sun had begun to settle lower over the K9 facility, stretching long shadows across the training yard where Ghost and Ethan Cole still sat together in quiet stillness. The air felt warmer now, carrying a gentle coastal breeze that moved through the chain-link fencing in slow, rhythmic waves. Nothing about the environment had changed structurally, yet everything within it felt different, as if the space itself had acknowledged a resolution that did not require announcement. Ghost remained close to Ethan, his posture relaxed, breathing even, no longer scanning for uncertainty or absence. Ethan's hand rested calmly on his back, steady and familiar, not as a handler enforcing command, but as someone simply choosing presence without condition. Staff Sergeant Daniel Harlow stood near the outer fence line, his arms now resting loosely at his sides, his attention no longer focused on assessment alone, but on observation of something that no longer fit into standard classification. The veterinary technician beside him checked the final behavioral readings on her tablet and then slowly lowered it, exhaling softly. "All stabilization markers have held consistent for over 40 minutes, she said. "There is no regression, no stress escalation, no withdrawal behavior." Harlow nodded slightly, his gaze still fixed on Ghost. He is not in recovery anymore, he said quietly. He is in continuity. Inside the yard, Ethan shifted slightly, adjusting his position so that he was sitting more comfortably against the ground. Ghost mirrored the small movement, not out of instruction, but out of alignment, as if even subtle changes in Ethan's posture were part of his own awareness now. Ethan looked down at him and gave a faint, almost unnoticeable nod. You are doing better than expected, he said softly. Ghost responded by leaning slightly into his side, the gesture simple and unforced, carrying no urgency, only presence. The sound of distant bass activity drifted faintly across the facility, trucks moving, doors closing, voices carrying through intercom systems, yet none of it disrupted the quiet within the enclosed yard. It was as if Ghost had learned to place all external noise into a different category, no longer allowing it to define his internal state. Harlow stepped a little closer to the fence, speaking in a low tone. We will need to prepare a long-term reintegration assessment plan, he said. If this stability continues, there may be grounds for re-established operational pairing. The technician nodded, though her expression suggested that she understood the limitations of terminology in describing what they were witnessing. It is not just operational, she said. It is relational memory continuity. Ethan heard the words, but did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked at Ghost for a long moment, as if considering something beyond procedure or assignment. Ghost lifted his head slightly in response, meeting Ethan's gaze with steady calm. There was no confusion there anymore, no searching, no fragmentation, only recognition that had settled into permanence. Ethan spoke quietly, almost under his breath. You do not need to prove anything anymore. Ghost remained still for a moment, then slowly shifted closer, pressing his shoulder lightly against Ethan's leg once more. It was not a request, not a reaction, but a choice repeated with certainty. Harlow exhaled slowly, his professional stance finally giving way to something more human in observation. I have seen recovery cases before, he said quietly, but never one that feels like completion instead of repair. The technician glanced at him briefly. Some bonds do not return, she said. They resume. As the light continued to soften across the yard, Ethan placed his hand once more on Ghost's back, and Ghost responded by closing his eyes briefly, remaining still, grounded, and present. The moment held without tension, without expectation, as if both had finally arrived at the point where nothing more needed to be searched for. The facility continued its routine in the background, unaware that within one small enclosed space, something had reached its natural conclusion without announcement or ceremony. Ghost stayed beside Ethan, not as something lost and found again, but as something that had never truly left, only waited until time allowed recognition to return. The light over the K9 facility had shifted into the soft gold of late afternoon, casting long, quiet shadows across the training yard where Ghost and Ethan Cole remained together. The air carried a calm stillness, not the tense kind from earlier, but a settled version of it, as if the entire base had unconsciously adjusted to the presence of something that no longer needed to be questioned. Ghost lay beside Ethan now, no longer sitting with alert tension, but resting in a fully relaxed posture, his white coat reflecting the warm light in faint gradients of silver and cream. Ethan sat beside him with one knee bent, his hand resting naturally on Ghost's shoulder, no longer cautious or tentative, but steady, as if it had always belonged there. Staff Sergeant Daniel Harlow stood a short distance away near the fence line, his posture unchanged, but his expression noticeably softer than earlier in the day. The veterinary technician beside him had stopped actively reviewing metrics and instead held her tablet lowered at her side, as if acknowledging that numbers alone no longer fully represented what was unfolding in front of them. Harlow spoke quietly, almost to himself. We came here to assess behavioral recovery, he said. But this is something beyond recovery. The technician nodded slowly. It is continuity of bond under restored conditions, she replied. Inside the yard, Ethan looked down at Ghost, who had shifted slightly closer during the conversation, maintaining contact without effort or instruction. You are going to be all right here, Ethan said softly, his voice calm and grounded. Ghost responded by lifting his head slightly, eyes meeting Ethan's with steady recognition. There was no confusion in his expression now, No searching or fragmentation. Only a quiet certainty that had replaced everything that came before. Ethan exhaled gently, looking out across the yard for a moment before returning his attention to Ghost. "They will probably try to place you back into structured rotation soon," he said. "You are still valuable to the unit." Ghost remained still as he listened, but when Ethan finished speaking, he pressed his shoulder a little more firmly against him, as if choosing proximity over designation. Harlow noticed the gesture and spoke in a low voice. "He is not responding to assignment language anymore," he said. "He is responding entirely to presence." The technician glanced at him. "That suggests the hierarchy of command has been replaced by relational anchoring," she said. Harlow nodded slowly. "Then the question becomes whether that is a limitation or an evolution." Ethan did not speak for a moment. He simply placed his hand more fully on Ghost's back, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing. "He does not need to be rebuilt," Ethan said quietly. "He just needed to be remembered." Ghost closed his eyes briefly at the sound of Ethan's voice, not falling asleep, but settling deeper into calm awareness, as if confirming that nothing about this moment required vigilance anymore. The yard around them remained unchanged, the fencing, the equipment, the distant movement of personnel continuing their routines beyond the perimeter, but within this enclosed space, time felt slower, almost intentional. Harlow stepped a little closer to the fence, his tone reflective. "We will classify this as full reintegration with primary handler restoration," he said. The technician looked at him briefly. "And the separation period?" she asked. Harlow paused. "It will be documented as unresolved absence," he said. "Not failure." Ethan heard the words, but did not react to them. Instead, he looked down at Ghost once more and gave a faint nod, as if confirming something internal rather than procedural. "You waited long enough," he said softly. Ghost lifted his head slightly, then leaned it gently against Ethan's leg, remaining there without movement. There was no longer any urgency in him, no sense of searching or anticipation. Only presence, steady and complete. As the sun dipped lower toward the horizon, the yard filled with a warm, fading light that softened the edges of everything it touched. Harlow finally turned slightly away from the fence, his voice quieter than before. "Some cases do not return to baseline," he said. "They return to something stronger." The technician did not respond immediately. She simply watched as Ethan remained seated beside Ghost, neither of them moving, neither of them needing to. Ghost stayed exactly where he was, his breathing calm, his body fully at rest, as if the long silence that had defined his waiting had finally been replaced by something permanent and unbroken.